for you. You're listening to Glue to bring what's current and new from around the world straight to you. It doesn't matter where you are, at home, work, or in your car. God loves every woman. God loves every woman. God loves every woman. You're listening to Glue.
Okay, well, everyone, welcome to Glue. That's God loves every woman, and He loves me, and He loves you too. And today we have a special guest. You can obviously tell he's not a woman, but this is Pastor Luis Beltre. And Luis, I'm giving you a special pass to be on Glue today because, like I mentioned, you're not a woman, but you do have you have something very important to share with us, and we're going to be talking about the teenage brain. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I feel very special for allowing me to enter your space, your women's space.
Yes.
But I know I'm going to be talking about something that very relevant, not just to men, but to women, because we all at some point have to interact and raise a child, and the brain is such an important part of that development. So I'm excited to share. Yeah.
Yay, thank you. Well, I'm just going to say a little bit about you. You are the senior pastor at Piney Forest Seventh Adventist Church, and then you have 3 other churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you pastor. Okay, and how long have you guys been there pastoring?
We are just over a year and a half now. So
okay.
yeah, we're really enjoying our time here in Virginia.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's jump right in, because just from looking at the news, looking on Facebook, Instagram, and all of these social media sites, we are seeing that teenagers are facing so many challenges right now. Suicide, depression, promiscuity. There's all of this confusion about gender now that's happening. Why are so many things happening right now with the teenagers?
It's quite complex, but as I served before, I've served as a pastor, as a church pastor. I served as a academy chaplain, a high school Bible teacher, and youth pastor for over 15 years. And so during my ministry with young people, I really wanted to get down to the core of what makes a young person behave or be the way they are, because they're a very unique creature. They're not an adult, and they don't behave like adults, although they want to be an adult. And so in my study, that led me to learn some really interesting things about the teenage brain, and how and why there are so many challenges that rise out of what's happening in the building of that brain. So that's why I'm excited to share with you today these findings.
Yes. So what are some of the things that you saw happening with teenagers? If you were a chaplain, you're a teacher, you were around them for many years, every day for long periods of time, what types of issues did you see them facing, like girls, and then also what the boys were facing?
Well, I think the challenges that they're facing are choices, the struggle to make good choices, and there are a lot of challenges for them to make those choices, and that really has to do with the fact that their brain. If I could start from the beginning, the child, when a child is developing, by the time they're 3 years old, 80% of their brain has been developed. I mean, that is incredible growth. That is an explosion of growth. By the time they turn 5, 90% of their brain is fully developed.
Oh, wow.
So I was blown away by this. And in fact, they say that 700 new neural connections are made per second when you're a child.
Oh my
That
goodness.
is that is mind-boggling. That is faster
Yes.
than any computer. I mean, and so what really the reason for this development is that you have to think about the fact that this brain, when this child is born, the brain has zero experience. It
Right.
doesn't understand the physics of the world. It does it's going to learn the emotions. It's going to learn motor skills. It's going to learn what love is. It's going to learn
Hmm.
how to use their eyes and the touch, sound, and movement. In fact, there's a really horrible study that or experiment that a German king performed. His name was Frederick II, a German king. Um, he decided that he wanted to experiment with babies. He took them away from their mothers and had the nurses not speak to the children any language. His assumption was that if the child grew up with no one speaking language to them, that they would naturally speak German. Which is a completely crazy idea. But
No.
he also added another element, and that was that they weren't supposed to touch the child or give them affection. And so the experiment, as you can imagine, was short-lived. The children did not thrive. In fact, they grew up not speaking any language at all, and because they died.
Oh no.
And so that
Wow.
really speaks powerfully about what love, not only in what we say to the child, but how we touch, how we hug, how we let them know they're loved, how important that is to their brain thriving and growing.
Yes.
And so,
Wow.
there's a lot of basic principles that the brain is learning at that age, and so that's why there's such an explosion of growth in the brain in those first 5 years.
Okay, so then after that, what is happening to the brain once they're like 10, 11,
Yeah,
12, working up into the teenage years? Are
right.
they still, is the brain still developing at a rapid pace, or does it slow down for a bit?
So something unique happens. So there's this explosion of growth, right, by the time they turn 5, and there's still some growth that happens, but that first 5 years is like, wow, explosion of growth. But then there's a bit of a pause, or not a pause, but just a slowdown, and then all of a sudden you get to the teenage years,
Mm.
and you get to that place where the brain begins reconstruction of the brain.
Oh.
Okay.
Huh.
So the neurologists call this pruning, a pruning process. You know, it's kind of like when you're pruning a bush. You fed it, it's grown, it's blossoming, it's developing, and now you get to the point where the bush needs pruning. And there's some
Right.
areas that it may not need anymore, or that doesn't use anymore, or it's not important anymore. And so the teenage years are wrapped up in this pruning phase. And this pruning phase is just as important as the first stage. Okay?
Mhm.
It's so important. Those two phases, those two stages, the first stage, this huge explosion of growth, of neurons growing. But then the teenage year comes, and there's a pruning phase where there's areas that are being strengthened, other areas that are being done away with. And so the brain is really, really restructuring to what it's going to eventually be. But the challenge is, and I want to show you a picture, if I can, of,
Okay.
of this, of the brain. So if you can see the picture of the brain, there is the cerebellum, and there's the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and then the frontal lobe. And so the way it works, there are 3 basic parts to the brain. And these parts are the brain stem, okay? The
Mhm.
brainstem. And the brainstem focuses on the unconscious functions or instincts. So when you touch something that's hot and you pull away, that's
Right.
completely instinctual, right? You didn't have to think. And
Right.
so that part of the brain focuses on the unconscious functions of your body. Okay, the limbic system is the area that I want to focus on. The limbic system is the seat of emotion and impulsivity. Okay, anger, sadness, happiness. All those emotions sit right there in the center of the brain. Okay,
So is
and
this
then
the
there's
temporal
the
lobe
third, right at the center. So right
in
above
the
the
middle?
brainstem. Right.
Okay.
And then you get to the third part, which is the cerebral cortex, and that's really pretty much the rest of the brain. But I want to focus on the front part, which is what we call the frontal lobe, and that
Okay.
is the seat of reason and conscience. Okay,
Mm.
and so that part is being reorganized and pruned. Okay, and so because that cerebral cortex is being pruned and reorganized, the brain has to have a seat of control.
Mm.
And since the frontal lobe at the teenage year is still not being, it's under reconstruction. Guess what? There are a bunch of signs that are up and saying there's construction here, and
Yes.
just when you're driving down the road and there's construction signs and you have to pull, they only have one lane that's open, or sometimes there's a detour. That's what's happening in the cerebral cortex. So meanwhile,
Wow.
what do? Where is the seat of control for the teenager? Well, guess what?
Mm.
The only place that the seat of control can go to is that limbic system, which is the seat of emotions and
Mm.
impulsivity. Okay? So this really
Wow.
just opens up a whole understanding as to why teenagers are the way they are. It all has to go with
Yeah.
what part of the brain is in control at that moment. It's not the frontal lobe. It's not the reasonable part of themselves that's in control at the moment. So,
Wow. So it's that would explain why, and I'm just going to use girls as an example because I'm a girl. Just I remember being so emotional when I was a teenager. It was just like I'd have a good day, and if somebody looked at me wrong at school, I'd come home crying. you know, just I remember just being so overly emotional about things, and I see girls now just they have the worst day of their lives if their hair doesn't look right. They'll just burst into tears and just crying and overly emotional, and you're going, are they okay? But
yeah,
it's not really their fault per se because
no,
their frontal lobe is not regulating their behavior.
no.
It's being regulated at the bottom.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. The frontal lobe is not in control yet because it's under construction. And so you said exactly what I was trying to imply with this is that the fact that when I think back at my teenage years, all the bad choices I made, all the moments I had where I was like, man, I wasn't really thinking when I did that, or I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
really thinking when I said that. It all goes back to the fact that I was not thinking logically
Right.
to make those choices. I was using my limbic system. In other words, I was focusing my decisions based on how I felt, my emotions, and they can be here today or here one moment and there the other. And this is why,
Mm-hmm.
as parents, as parents, sometimes you're pulling your hair because you're trying to work with your teenager, and your teenager feels happy in one moment and completely mad at you the next, and you're like, what did I do? What's going on? And
Yes.
so this explains it. They
Mm.
really don't know what's happening in their minds because they are emotionally a roller coaster. Many of them
Right.
just a roller coaster ride, and they're not really thinking logically about everything they need to do. So the impulsive side says, I want immediate gratification right now, this moment.
Mm.
I'm not thinking about the future. I'm thinking about right now.
Mm.
This
Wow.
is why sometimes it's a struggle as a teenager to make good choices. And this really leads me to, the biblical side of this, because I was just blown away how God has created the brain. And it's so amazing to see the different phases of the development of the brain and how an important role parents play in the child's development. I mean, in Proverbs 22, verse 6, it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Mm.
This is not, these are not just words. These are not just, we'll teach them what they need to be so they can grow up to be what they ought to be. This really goes down to the brain. The brain needs structure. You have to think about the fact that that child in the first 5 years develops the 90% of their brain. And within that 5 years, they're learning not only how to use their hands and their eyes and move about, they're also learning what is right from wrong.
Mm.
What is
Wow.
good and what is bad. And just like learning how to not touch hot things,
Mm-hmm.
those essential inhibitors that they need, they also need the inhibitors to say that's wrong and that's right. And so that's important. And then by the time they get to the teenage year, guess what? The parent, when the child is rebelling and screaming and kicking and saying, I hate you, or I'm mad, or they slam the door, they're actually saying, they're not saying, I want you to, distant yourself from me. They're actually saying, Mom, Dad, I need you to be my cerebral cortex, my co-pilot, because it's under construction. And so I need you to work with me through my emotions to be my frontal lobe while I'm still growing.
Wow.
That's
That
what,
is deep.
be my co-pilot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So this is just showing right here how important it is for
Yeah.
parents to step up during this time and really work with their teenagers instead
Yes.
of just saying, oh, here's a cell phone, go keep yourself busy in your room on Facebook. I'm going to go over here and do this. This is why it's so important to not just, let them play video games all day and neglect them. Because I think it's hard for parents too when their kids are acting crazy. They don't know what to do. So they just, put them in their room, give them a phone, let them go out with their friends. But what you're saying is really speaking to me that parents need to really be on top of helping their kids during this time, because like you said, they have to be their frontal lobe and help them make these right choices, because if they don't, then as like you said, they're under construction, they're going to form bad habits and bad thinking. And then when does the brain stop forming during that time? You said
Okay,
it's under construction, so when does it stop?
Yeah, so check this out. You've taught the child all these moral values that are a mirror image of what you believe and your worldview. So that's the childhood stage. They believe everything you say and they embrace it and they make it theirs. But then when they become a teenager, the pruning side means also that they begin to look at every value you taught them and they decide, well, is this going to be my values too? Or am I going to say, no, I'm going to create my values? Does that make sense? So that pruning phase is so important, because it's not like, okay, once they've grown up to, their childhood days are over, and they become a teenager, although I believe they're still a child in some ways. You think, well, my job is done. I've taught them all the values I needed to teach them, and now they can decide for themselves, right? No. To reinforce some of those values in their lives, because they're in that pruning phase, they're also listening to their friends. They're beginning to look at the world. They're beginning to listen to the world, and they're beginning to prune and decide, okay, Am I going to, was my mom right? Was my dad right? Or is Google right? Is YouTube right? Is Instagram right? My friend right? You know what I mean? And so this is where that pruning phase is. And this is such an important phase because once this pruning is over, that adult is pretty much set for life. In other words, by the time the 25 years come around, which is usually around the time the brain is finally, the frontal lobe is fully done and constructed, and it's in control. That person has pretty much created their own worldview, which you hope it will reflect yours.
Right.
But if you are not involved, guess who's going to prune that worldview? Their friends.
Yes.
Media. Whoever else is more present in their lives than you are. And so as much as you think it's hard and you think, well, my child is just asking for space, so I'm going to give them space. You want to give them space, but be present in their lives. Yeah. Be present in the choices. Talk about the choices. Talk about the pros and cons. Help them to begin to see how to think about the values that you've taught them, because it doesn't no longer work that you can say, well, this is right because I said so. That doesn't work anymore.
You have to give them a reason.
Work them through the process of why this is a better choice.
Wow. That is so powerful. And it makes me wonder if this is why, because this is a Christian show and you're a pastor, and I just believe that the devil attacks teenagers.
Yeah.
And this makes it clear that maybe he's attacking them during this pivotal time because he's trying to form them to not want to follow God. He's putting so much media and just, all of these distractions. Because I really feel like, this is the time where they get attacked the most.
Solomon was so wise when he wrote the book of Proverbs. And if you can imagine, he loved his son so much that he actually wrote that book for his young son. Oh. And if you read the book of Proverbs, it's full of wisdom and full of good advice and full of hey, this is what happens when you make a bad choice. Let me read some of it. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 4 to 5, it says, for giving prudence to those who, look at what he said. He says, this book is about giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. And let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance.
Wow.
So this book, he starts out right there in the first chapter by saying, this book is for you to gain wisdom and prudence and make good choices that will lead you to be a discerning person. In Proverbs 4, verse 1 to 4, it says, listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so that do not forsake my teaching. For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart, keep my commands, and you will live. So this is a father reasoning with his son. And that's what we need to do. We need to reason with our children at that age. And once they get to the teenage year, reason with them as much as we can. And so that the Bible is very clear about this. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 18 to 20, it says, fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Wow.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes.
It really needs to be that ongoing dialogue with your teenage child, that ongoing dialogue about life and choices and wisdom, and because they need to hear that. It's not something that you think, well, they'll get it when they they become adults and life will teach them that lesson. No, you need to teach them that lesson. It's
yes. So what would you say to a parent who's going to see this and going to think, help, help me, what do I do? What would be the first thing for you to, if someone came to you, because you're a pastor,
right,
and they said, help, my teenage daughter or son is out of control.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do.
I can't tell you how much damage you can make to the child's development when you choose to relate with your child as another equal or as a friend, rather than as a parent, which means there are many times when you're going to have to say, I'm sorry, but this is not going to happen today. This is not allowed in my house. And so they're going to kick and scream. They're going to be mad at you. They may be mad at you for a week or two. I mean, I remember a story. A lady was sharing her story on a radio show I was listening to recently, where she said, right now, I'm telling you right now, I have 2 children, teenagers. They're both mad at me for 2 different, completely separate reasons. Talk to me in a week, but I know I need to stick to what I know they need to be doing. And so this is important. They're going to kick and scream with you, but the number one thing is you need to make sure that you are not their friend. You are their parent. They need you, although they may not say it, they need you to lay down principles that are going to help them in life. Number 2, we live in a postmodern age. And what that means is it permeates throughout all society, this idea. And the postmodern age culture promotes tolerance and acceptance of conflicting values that go against Christian principles. And so they have this exposure all the time through media, because there are constantly conflicting values that are merging in their lives. And so they say, well, what is right? What is wrong? I mean, society's telling me I can choose whatever I want, because it's pretty much everything goes. And so our children are exposed to these conflicting values through the media and internet, and our society is quickly losing its moral backbone. And young people are left wondering, like ships in the sea without an anchor. They don't know what's really right and wrong. There are so many of these interest groups and all these safe spaces that are being created nowadays, where kids can be something completely outside of what God had created them to be. And if we as parents are not involved in making sure they are aware of what the Bible teaches, the principles that the Bible teaches, they're going to be left out wondering, what is the meaning of my life? Where do I come from? And they're going to choose to be something that is completely contradictory to your values, because you weren't able to be there and teach them those principles. No one else is teaching those principles to them. It's your role, okay? And so in John chapter 14, verse 6, it says, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So in this postmodern age, this world where everything is uncertain, everything goes, there are no moral standards. There's Jesus. And there's the Word of God. And Jesus says, I am the only way to a life everlasting, a life that is worth living, a life full of meaning, purpose, hope, joy, and truth. And so, as much as possible, you want to invite your child to have forever friendship with Jesus, to introduce them to who Jesus is, to
Yeah.
pray for them to fall in love with Jesus, to allow Jesus to be their way, their truth, and their life. And they will love you for this because you are giving them an anchor that does not move, an anchor that is not wishy-washy, it's not here and there, but it's steadfast and something they can really build their lives on.
Yes, that's so beautiful, Luis. I was just sitting here thinking, can you share just briefly your testimony? Because you're a pastor now, and usually I think people, he's just a pastor. He probably had a perfect life, always knew he wanted to be a preacher, and people will think that about pastors. But you did have a time in your life where you had strayed away from God, and you were a young man when you gave your heart to the Lord. So can you just share a little bit of your testimony just to give someone out there encouragement?
Sure, yeah. I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a pastor. My mom was a very Christian woman and very committed to her relationship with God. And I could have had better parents, but I ended up having a rebellious teenage years. And so once I turned teenager, I wanted to explore the world. I got involved in bad company, and I started listening to music that really wasn't building me up, and I started getting involved in the party crowd and wasting my time. I dropped out of school. I working in a dead-end job and just wasting away. And I remember one day just looking at my life and realizing I wasn't going anywhere, and I was sinking in like the bottom pit of despair. And so I found myself in my room one day just crying and saying, for the first time, crying out to God and saying, God, if you're real, if there's hope for my life, please help me.
Yeah.
And I have to attest that my parents were very patient with me, and they always prayed for me. And they were never like pointing fingers at me and saying, you're bad. They were very gracious. They gave me space to rebel and really kind of figure things out, but they were always praying for me. And so I remember that night that I prayed that prayer, and I felt for the first time, I opened my heart, really, really opened my heart to God, and He made Himself known in my life. I felt the warmth of His presence in my heart. I felt the weight of guilt and shame and all this ugliness that I was carrying with me, all of a sudden just being lifted. And I can't tell you, that was the first night I actually had a full night's sleep, so rested. Up the next morning, I grabbed my favorite rock band album, and I put it in. At that time, it was a cassette tape. I put it in my radio. I pressed play because this is what I normally did, and I couldn't get to the first 5 seconds of the song. I stopped it. I pulled it out. I was like, "This is like," this is like eating vomit. The worst thing. I was just like, I can't listen to this anymore. I don't want this in my life. And I remember throwing it away. I got rid of a lot of music that was really just leading me down a wrong path. And I just started to read the Bible. I fell in love with Jesus, and I found meaning and purpose, and I found hope. I found identity. I found confidence. I found everything that the world could not give me. I found it all in Jesus. And then I went back to school. I got my high school diploma. I went to local community college, and then I went into a university. And I can tell you, God led me to a beautiful life. I married a wonderful woman, and it's all because of I really direct it all back to that moment, that life-changing moment where I gave my life to Jesus. Everything changed.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so when that happened, that gave you your sense of purpose. Because in that time before that night, you didn't want to be a pastor, did you?
I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I was not thinking about being a pastor at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Okay.
so it was just that night really I was a new person. I was a new
Mm.
person, born again. This is
You're
what
born
Jesus
again.
talks about, being born again.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Because I just want people to know that since we're talking about teenagers and the brain and how that's when God found you was in your teenage years.
Yeah.
And I want to bring up something else is that you have a book too that you
Yes.
wrote. What is the book
Yes.
called?
It's called Finding Hope, and it was a book I wrote just a few years ago. And it's if you can see it on the screen, it's a book that really stems from my study on postmodern culture. And I was trying to figure out what is the main idea that's really driving our Western society today, and how does Jesus fit into that picture? Because I believe that even though we live in a different era, in a secular society, I still believe Jesus is extremely relevant to us today, even more so than ever before. And so this book I wrote because in a world of mistrust, I found confidence in Jesus. In a world of uncertainty, I found certainty in Jesus. And in a world of cynicism, I found hope in Jesus. And so finding hope in an age of despair really wrestles with the problems of postmodernism and then shows you the solutions through Jesus Christ.
Amen. Where can people purchase this? Is it on
Yeah.
Amazon?
Yeah, so they can go on to lulu.com.
Oh, Lulu. Okay.
LULU.com, and they just have to type in Finding Hope, and Finding Hope in an Age of Despair. My name is Luis Beltre, and they should be able to find the book there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Awesome. Yay, thank you so much. So you guys, you pastor in Virginia.
Yes.
So can you let any viewers who might live near you, if they wanted to come to one of your services,
absolutely.
let us know where your church is and what are your service times?
Sure. So my church, my head church is it's called Piney Forest Seventh-day Adventist Church. You can find us on YouTube. We have a channel on YouTube, and we air our programs every Sabbath. So please come and visit us. We're in Danville, Virginia, and just look us up. Piney Forest Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay. Wonderful. Yay. Well, thank you, Pastor Beltre. I really appreciate your time, and maybe we can have another show another time. Maybe we can talk about this again or cover another topic. And
absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you for having me. I know this is a woman-only program, but I'm honored that a male representative could be part of your show.
Well, thank you so much. Yay.
I speak on behalf of mankind.
Mankind, that's cute. Well, thank you so much.